I'd like you to read, if you haven't already done it, the section on Genesis, which is page 101 to 156 in your copy. This is an earlier version here. Alexander, how many of you read this? Okay, read Alexander 101 to 156 in preparation for the next big slab of work we'll be doing. Okay, what then, the emphasis in Genesis 1 is not on in what way are human beings like God, but what is the vocation of human beings as creatures made in the image of God. Now this is one of the foundations for Lutheran teaching on vocation here. Vocation not just of Christians, people in the church, but vocation of all human beings. What is our vocation? What's our calling? What is our mission as human beings here on earth? Well, quite simply, we are to work with God and to rest with God. Not work for God, but work with God. And we do that because we are made in the image of God. This means that all of us have royal status. Chris, could you read Psalm 8, 3 to 8, in which we hear something very important about what it means to be in the image of God?
I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love, higher than the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies.
Psalm 8?
Verse 3. 108, verse 3?
No, Psalm 8. Psalm 8. Oh, by the way, Chris, just while I get the word that's used in Psalm 106 is not tselem or demuth, but tavnith, coming from the verb bana, build, and it means a model or a copy. Okay. It's one of the synonyms for a statue, righto? And it's a very important word in Exodus, where the tabernacle is a copy of what God shows Moses in heaven. The word tavnith is used there. Okay, let's go to Psalm 8 now, not 108, 3 to 8.
Okay. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You made him rule over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet, all flocks and herds and the beasts of the field, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, all that swim the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in the earth.
Right, now, notice that that's is built on Genesis 1, but there's something added here. It says that God has made humanity, Adam, a little lower than the angels, but has given human beings honor and majesty. They are two royal terms. So God has made human beings as regents, co-regents under him. They aren't absolute monarchs, but they are governors or regents. They rule with God and they have royal status. So all human beings are royalty. Notice how pagan thinking, which privileged certain human beings and said that they were royalty, is now democratized. All human beings are God's royalty. And every human being rules the world together with God. By the way, that word radah here is explained by he has put all things under his feet. In the New Testament, this is picked up by Jesus, who puts everything under his feet. And the word that's used there for putting under his feet is the verb subordinate. And so the language of subordination, which is very contentious, has its root in this whole frame of discourse. Human beings have royal status and they have a royal function. Now, both the Jewish tradition and the Orthodox tradition does this very dramatically at every wedding ceremony. The bride and bridegroom go under a canopy, and they are regarded, or they are crowned with wreaths. So the wedding ceremony is their coronation ceremony. Can you see where it gets from? Beautiful theology. So the wedding is coronation. Just a little aside, this teaching has been very influential in the Western world against tyranny, against the overextended claims of kings, and for the establishment of democracy in the West, because all human beings are in the image of God. And so the English notion of the sovereignty of the people is not primarily a legal political doctrine. Guess where it comes from? The Puritans who pushed it got it from the Old Testament, the sovereignty of the people. Now that's a critical notion and a bedrock of our whole political system, the whole notion of the sovereignty of the people. Now that's a political doctrine which originally was a theological doctrine, like many things. Now what's the tasks of human beings? Is to procreate. And procreate doesn't mean just having children, but raising children, and so that human beings reach their full potential, the whole gamut of family life, subduing the earth, taking care of the earth, and ruling over the animals. However, what's interesting here, as always, is not just what Genesis says, but what it doesn't say. God did not create human beings to rule over whom?
Human beings.
Sorry?
Other human beings.
Other human beings. This has also been very important in Western history. And the influence in the Old Testament and the development of our political system, saying essentially no human beings do rule. We need somebody to look after things, but God did not create human beings to rule over human beings. Can you see? It restricts this to the earth and the animals. Yes?
I was going to say that in an Eden-esque world, we wouldn't need
That's right.
people to rule over us.
Yes.
So,
in that sense, in the sense that we normally understand rule, but there is rule in the sense of order. But in an Edenist world, you don't need somebody to enforce order because everybody will be ordered and live in an orderly way.
A modern day example of the people who do this ruling would be the police, the court systems,
Absolutely.
Those sort of things,
Yes.
not the politicians.
Well, the politicians, if they do what they're supposed to do.
But they've been empowered to.
Yeah, I was going
They've been empowered to rule, and basically all governments have very, very limited power. Basically, to make sure they don't make the system work, they make sure that the system works properly. And they basically step in when things go wrong. When things go right, there's very little role for government. I don't know whether you realise it. There's been a massive intervention of our government and all governments in the economy in a way that has not been done for the last 50 years. Why?
Because it went wrong.
Because it's gone wrong. There's been massive intervention in government in the whole environmental sector, which the government never looked at before. Why? It's gone wrong. When it goes right, okay, you just let it work. The role of government is basically to step in when things go wrong, and this is the God-given role of government. And it's hinted at that those two terms, radar and kavash. Now, when things go wrong, when things go out of order, when human beings exploit each other, exploit the world, abuse each other, abuse the natural resources, that's when it's the role of government to step in. They can't solve the problem, but they can lessen the problem. Yes?
some political systems call their politicians magistrates, whereas ours are ministers.
Ministers.
Which means they're servants.
They're servants.
In a way.
Yeah.
Whereas a magistrate is over you, and so there's quite a difference.
Yeah.
So in the Byzantine system, I know there was a magistrate.
Magistrates.
They're above them.
Yeah.
But we always have these ministers because it's
Or governors. They have governors. What you need to realise is how profoundly the democratic system of government, which we take for granted, has deep theological roots. And you can't transfer it to other cultures that don't have a Christian substructure, as George Bush found out when he tried to impose democracy on Iraq. It doesn't work. The presuppositions aren't there. What it did then was unleash chaos, anarchy, because the foundations for it weren't there.
And similarly, when the EU then denies Christianity in its democratic charter, then it's doomed for failure in some ways.
It is cutting off the branch that supports it. And that's happening in our society with the de-Christianisation of society, is what is happening is that we are chopping down the stump that supports the tree of our civil life, if I can use that. But that's another question. So that's tasks of human beings. Now, notice it's not just tasks of Christians or Jews. This is the task of every human being. Every human being is called to do God's work, works with God. That is fundamental to Luther's teaching on vocation and Luther's teaching on two kingdoms. And it comes out of this, Luther would maintain, that a wise atheist or pagan can be a better king than a Christian fool. And it's something that has not been heard, and in our society, we Lutherans basically represent a minority position in this, in our land, which basically sees God at work. Most Christians see God at work only in the church, not at work in society. And if he is at work in society, it's like this firebrand guy with his fire ministries in Melbourne, Danny Nadila or something, sees it only in negative terms of God's judgment on Victoria for allowing abortion. Now, there's an element of truth in it, but God's judgment isn't limited just to people who sanction abortion. That's the only role that those evangelicals have for God's working in the world. There's no positive role. Lastly, you can't have a look at this, what God says about creating humanity in his image, without seeing it in its context. Always the unexpected. I would have expected the story to stop with day 6. But its climax comes in day 7, where God rests from his work of creation, and he blesses and sanctifies the 7th day. And by doing so, he fills in or points to what is the gap here. So, in what way do human beings resemble God and are made to resemble God? A clue is given in this business of blessing and sanctifying. Paul picks this up in the New Testament, and he talks about us being renewed in Christ, and that the image of God, which is distorted, it hasn't been lost. We still have the image here, and still in a distorted way, we bear the image of God. We don't lose the image of God. The image is distorted. But the distorted, perverted image becomes restored in Jesus and is restored in all righteousness and holiness. So through Christ and sharing his righteousness, his holiness, we human beings are restored in the image of God as recipients of God's blessing, all God's blessings, not just physical blessings but spiritual blessings, including the gift of the Holy Spirit, and we share in God's holiness. We then mediate God's blessing, God's holiness to each other and to the world. So that fills in that X, the unknown. Any questions on this big, big area, which I've just skated over the top of? Yes, Chris?
One of the vocations of humankind is to procreate children.
Yes.
Yeah. So does that mean that in countries like China, where they've implemented the rule of only having one child,
Yes.
Because the land is full,
Yes.
is that going against God's will, or is that actually going with God's
It's going with God's will, because it is to fill the earth, not to overfill it. These words are chosen very carefully, and it's so easy to misread it by not paying close attention to exactly what it says. If something is full, that's it.
But it's always full. Everyone always,
Okay.
The world was going to get to, in the 1900s,
No, but just
they predicted 2000, there were going to be 2 billion people in the world, and it would be catastrophic and unsustainable.
Yes.
There are 6 billion, that's fine.
Okay, but that's a relative term, because you fill up to what it can deal with at the capacity at that time. You need to see what's changed since the 16th, 17th and 18th century. So filling the earth now is different to what it was filling the earth 100 years ago, maintain. But you can't ultimately use this passage to restrict it, say, okay, one-child policy, or as many children as you can possibly have. God's mandate is for us to fill the earth. Now, he hasn't told us what that is. That's for us to determine.
Well,
it's part of
our rule over the earth.
That's part of our rule over. So, procreation doesn't control us. We control procreation. Vegetables, plants don't control procreation. It happens automatically. I can decide to have sex or not to have sex. I can decide to be married or not to be married. I can decide when to have sex and not to have sex. We are responsible, and God has given us responsibility in this. But I don't want to get this a huge can. Can you see how these passages open up so many controversial and very important topics in our society? Yes, Joshua?
I'm just wondering if you could make some comments about Luther and other reformers and the image of God, because you get sort of allegation a lot that perhaps Luther went too far and talked sometimes about the image being lost and that sort of thing.
Quite often these things are careless and stupid debates because they don't take into account context and what is intended. Is the image of God lost or not? You put the question in that way, and as soon as somebody comes to me with that question, in case you don't realise, do you know what I'm going to say?
False antithesis.
False antithesis. Right? You've learned something, Tom. Thank God for that. I'll only answer the question is, what do you mean by lost? In what sense lost? And if I had to give it, and you say, give me a plain answer, I'd say yes and no. And I'm not trying to dodge the question, but in what sense is it lost?
Righteousness.
If you wanted it, it's the righteousness, the holiness, the Christ-likeness. It's that aspect that's lost. But human beings are still in the image of God. It's interesting when you go to Genesis chapter 5, which talks about the children of Adam and Eve. It talks that they are made in the image of God. And likewise, when you come to Genesis 9, the story of the flood, why is it that human beings are not to kill human beings? Because they are made in the image of God. So human beings don't lose the image of God, but they lose what is one aspects of the image of God. And that is, in New Testament terms, righteousness, holiness. But the fact that human beings are meant to be regents, co-regents with God, that human beings are meant to procreate, that human beings are meant to take care of the earth and the plants and the animals, of course that's not lost. Right? Can you see? You've got to nuance the argument. And a lot of the debate about the loss of the image of God presupposes that some aspect of us is in the image of God. Now, if our intellect is made in the image of God, quite obviously if you sin, you don't lose your intellect. What happens to your intellect? Your mind? It doesn't work the way it's meant to work. If your feelings are made in the image of God, does it mean you lose all feelings? No. What you'd lose? Your emotions get out of control. Passions take over. They don't work properly. And you can see it most clearly in the imagination. You remember that one of the results of the fall is that every imagination of the human heart is evil from youth. Imagination. God doesn't take away imagination because of the fall, but what happens? It's distorted. It doesn't work the way it's meant to work. It becomes fascinated with evil rather than good. It goes into fantasy rather than reality. And if you want to see the fall most clearly, I think you can see it in two areas, and in the image of God, in the area of sexuality and the area of the imagination. Yes, again, Joshua?
Can I just get one more in there?
You can.
If part of the creation and the image of God is male and female,
Yes.
then how, a question that you sometimes hear out there is, how can the new image of God, Jesus Christ, how can that be in a male human?
Well, because God didn't create humanity as a generic being, but he created them male and female. So if God had become a human being, he had to become one of the two sexes. And it also means that the sex that God chose for the incarnation is not going to be insignificant. And the significance of that will lie in the Old Testament and will lie way back here in the whole of the Old Testament. And I'm going to touch on part of the significance. Now we're getting on really dangerous ground and really controversial stuff in our circles as well in the whole of the church. Because behind this lies all those arguments about the not just homosexual, heterosexual arguments and marriage arguments, but the arguments about the ordination of women. That's where this sits. But I'm not going to go into that here. Okay? Not because I want to dodge it. You know I don't dodge that one. Now, which leads then to this. What's most amazing is that Genesis 1 focuses on the big world, God's creation and ordering of the big world, the world of the sun and the moon and the stars, planet Earth, human beings, animals, sea, land. That's the big world. But for most of us, that big world is not of immediate practical significance. Our life is lived in a little world, the little world of our experience. And the little world of our experiences focuses on home and family and work. That's the little world. You came into existence in a marriage of two human beings, in a home, and the world that you have grown to know started off in the womb of your mother, with your parents, with your brothers and sisters, in a particular house, in a particular place. That's the little world of human beings. Now, the most important thing about the big world is the seventh day. God's plan for the big world has to do with everything that's hinted at that seventh day. But it's interesting that God's plan for the little world culminates in the creation of what?
The rest.
What?
The rest day.
No, that's the big world. The little world, Genesis 2. We get the focus, big picture panning shots, and then you get close, intimate shots. Woman. As the crown of creation in the little world, and with woman comes the creation of marriage. So the central thing, the focus in the little world is woman, wife, marriage. Now, if there is a controversial area and an area in which you will need to doing a lot of teaching, it's in the area of marriage. Most young people of your generation and the immediate generation before that have rejected what they regard as the traditional notion of marriage, which they identify with the Christian notion of marriage. And so it's common for young couples to live together and not realizing what damage they're doing to themselves and society by doing this. But what you need is to teach Christians, forget about the people outside the church, Christians once again, the importance of marriage and the place of marriage and understanding of marriage. A lot of my feeling is, and this is, I've got 40-something years of pastoral experience, that one of the reasons for the great apostasy that's occurred from the church here in Australia, I can't speak about elsewhere, has to do with sex and marriage. Which means that if you are going to re-evangelize Australia, you won't be able to dodge the question of marriage. If you are going to minister to people of your generation, all the way back to my generation, you'll need to have to face that question of sex and marriage. Because one of the reasons that people have gone away from the church is because of guilt and the broadest possible sense of consequences of that in this area, or rejection of this in this area. Big topic again, teasing you. Once again, I can just touch on this, but there are wonderful resources here for you in the Old Testament. Let's begin. First of all, I'd like you just to understand what is meant by the term Adam and the way it's used. There's just so much in it. Adam, you have it used in two ways in Genesis 1 through to Genesis 9, either with an article or without an article. If it's used without an article, Adam by itself, it's humanity. God created Adam in his image, humanity. Secondly, without an article, it can be used as a proper name for the first male person, Adam. We get that in English. So it's the proper name for the first primal male person. And the opposite of that is then Eve. The opposite of humanity is animal life. The opposite of Adam is Eve. Then third, Adam can be used as the proper name for all humanity. God created man in his image, meaning humanity, and it's the name. What name is given to the whole human race? It's Adam. Now, this creates problems in translation because there's no way that you can carry this across, that you can use Adam as a proper name for all human beings. It's a proper name for the first male person, but you can't use it as a proper name for all human beings. Secondly, if you have an article, it can be used in three ways. Ha'adam means the human race. You can't say the humanity, the man, the human race. So the human race, and it's an inclusive term without exceptions. Ha'adam can also be the primal male person, mainly Adam. And it's thirdly, it can be used in a much narrower sense. Adam used in the sense of husband, not just the primal male person, but the primal husband, the first human being who was a husband of the first wife. Now, notice that range of reference. And I want to go just to the next point, and we'll stop there. What we've already touched on, and the first word in the Bible is not about the differences between male and females, which once again, surprise, is being rediscovered in our society after years of people saying there was no difference. Now everybody has become fashionable to accentuate and to understand male-female differences. The Bible starts off with emphasizing the similarity of male and female. Both together have a common humanity. Both are full human beings, not incomplete human beings. It's not that a male is a complete human being or female is a complete human being, or it's not as if both male and female are incomplete beings and they need to be sexually involved or married to become a full human being. So there's a common humanity for all, whether you are married or not married, whether you're single or whatever your state is, there's a common humanity that we have. Secondly, we are all equally alike, created in God's image. All human beings share God's mandate. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. All human beings are equally blessed by God within the order of creation. That needs to be emphasized, and it is totally and utterly countercultural because we divide human beings into classes and races and say that some are better than others or more superior than others or more blessed than others. God's blessing in creation goes equally to all human beings. So there's a common blessing. But more counterculturally is that all human beings are equally fallen. We share the same fallen state. There are no inferior races. There are no immoral races. There are no immoral groups in themselves. All human beings, including Australians and Americans, are equally fallen human beings. And we've equally been devastated by sin. That includes God's zone, Queensland. Okay. Now,
Use the word, brother.